Unsolved.
The JonBenet Ramsey case. Blood samples.
Authorities have received DNA test results in connection with the JonBenet Ramsey homicide, sources said Wednesday. They got them from things like fingernail scrapings, blood, hair found on a blanket, but the crime scene was cleaned so well that parts of the tests are not as conclusive as they could be.
Now, in this episode, we're going to look at the DNA of all these people shown here, focusing mainly on the men, because we're looking at comparing it to that unknown male DNA found in a mixture of JonBenet's blood on her underwear, with her DNA being the majority component and the unknown male DNA being the minority component. And in 2008, the unknown male DNA being found on the waistband of her long johns. Now, this is the shirt that JonBenet was wearing that night, and you can see the cutout on the sleeve there, and then the cutout in the center. And those two blood stains were attributed to JonBenet, were tested and found to be JonBenet's DNA. And then you have the long johns, and that's when they did in 2008 a test on the waistband, and they found unknown male DNA that matched the minority component on JonBenet's underwear mixed in her blood. Now, this video just tells you a little bit about the person and if they were DNA tested or not. And it doesn't include any of the Ramseys. It doesn't have John Ramsey, Patsy Ramsey, Burke Ramsey, John Andrew, Melinda Ramsey, or Jeff Ramsey, because all of the DNA from their blood was tested and shown not to be a match to the unknown male DNA. Linda Hoffman was John and Patsy's housekeeper during the time that JonBenet was murdered. Now, I believe this is the house that Linda and Mervyn and their daughter was renting from Linda's sister, where she got behind on her payments, and she asked Patsy for a loan. Now, the way that the blood was tested was first they determined the blood type, if it was O, positive or negative, blood type A or B or AB. So here you can see that Mervyn is type A and Linda has blood type A. And then they forwarded the blood sample for DNA analysis, and that's where they compared it to the unknown male DNA. And Mervyn wasn't a match to the unknown male DNA. Glenn Meyer was a tenant in Joe and Betty Barnhill's house, and he was a complete stranger to John and Patsy until the night of December 23rd, when he came over to their Christmas party and wanted to speak with Joe about something. And so he lived almost directly across from the Ramsey's house. And his DNA was tested, and it wasn't a match. Fleet White and Priscilla were good friends of the Ramseys, and they lived about a mile away from the Ramseys. And Patsy called Priscilla shortly after the 911 call to come over to their house immediately because Patsy needed them. Now, I'm not sure why, but Priscilla White's blood was tested first, and then a week or two later, Fleet White's blood was tested. And Fleet White's did not match that unknown male DNA. Cliff Gaston lived in California with Allison Shoney, and they were visiting Fleet and Priscilla because Allison is Priscilla's sister. And this photograph of Cliff is 20 years later. He was younger when he was visiting the night JonBenet Ramsey was murdered. Now, their blood was taken in July, and Cliff and Bill were not a match to that unknown male DNA. John Fernie, along with his wife Barbara, were friends of the Ramseys, and they lived in this house about 10 miles south of the Ramseys. And their blood was taken, and they were tested, and John Fernie's DNA was compared to that unknown male DNA and was not a match. Jeff Merrick was a friend of John Ramsey's from the early 1970s, and they worked together back then, and he kept in touch with John the whole time. And I believe he lost his job, and he called John and asked him about if he could work for Axis Graphics, and John hooked him up with that job, and he kind of regretted doing that because they ended up firing him because John's father-in-law ended up demoting him and then firing him. And his DNA did not match that unknown male DNA. Stephen Colby and his wife and 3 or 4 children lived on 14th Street, so they were neighbors with John and Patsy, and they shared that back alleyway to their houses. And his youngest son, Eben, was at the Ramsey's house playing Nintendo with Burke. And as far as I know, his DNA has never been tested to that unknown male DNA. Bill McReynolds, who played Santa Claus, was a retired college professor, and he lived up in the mountains with his wife Janet, who was, I believe, also a retired college professor. And she was kind of
strange.
And they had 2 children, 2 boys, and one of them had gotten in trouble with the law frequently. And Bill, Jesse, and Tristan DNA was tested, and it did not match that unknown male DNA. Now, I wanted to point out, in all the handwriting samples that I've looked at, comparing them to the ransom note, Janet McReynolds' handwriting, in my opinion, is the closest to the ransom note. She writes her little A's in that unique style like the ransom note. And so if you look at the word teach her, and then in the ransom note, her, and you put them side by side, don't those look very similar? To me, they are very close. Not only do her letters look similar, like the T in her writing, and in the ransom note, the T and that, those weird small A's, she even spaces her words out like the ransom note with the kind of extra space. And she was there, Janet was there at the Ramsey's Christmas party on December 23rd. So all that would have had to been done was for her to take Patsy's notepad from the house and then write the ransom letter at her house, and then whoever came in and killed JonBenet just brought the writing pad back and tore out the pages and placed them on the spiral staircase. James Michael Thompson, or T.J. Colfax, lived in Denver, and after JonBenet was murdered, he became a transporter. He picked up dead bodies, and he stole the pages that had JonBenet's listing in the morgue when she arrived there, her body. And as far as I know, his DNA has never been tested. Randall Simons, or Simons, lived like 100 miles east of Denver in this very small town here. And he was the man that took pictures of JonBenet and later sold them to a tabloid. And he was arrested in 1991, and then he was arrested after JonBenet's murder on being naked in public or something in this small town here, and then later was arrested for child pornography photographs. And his DNA was tested, and it didn't match the unknown male DNA. Now I found out much more about him. He was an Oak Ridge resident, and he lived right here in an apartment right there with that address right there, across the street from AMW Root Beer, and they have internet service there, and they have a quite unique old style A&W root beer. And he was using their internet service often, and so he was surveilled by the police and caught and arrested. Now, Joe Barnhill and his wife Betty lived across the street, and they were the couple that would watch JonBenet's dog. And Joe and his son, blood was taken and tested to that unknown male DNA and was not a match. But someone did forget somebody. That dog. Did anyone test that dog's DNA? Jay Elowsky was a friend of John Ramsey's, and he was the owner of Pasta J's. And John Ramsey had invested some money into the restaurant. And as a matter of fact, John moved to Moab, Utah, and Jay moved there also and started a second location of Pasta J's there. And his DNA was tested, and it did not match that unknown male DNA. John Ramsey had an employee at his business, Sandra Henderson, who was divorced from her husband, and her boyfriend was John Brooks, and his birth name was John Chiselbrook, and he changed his name sometime in the 80s for some reason. Well, anyway, she stole from Axis Graphics and was fired and was forced to repay the amount of money. I don't think she did pay it though, but it was like $18,000, the portion that she owed, and there was some kind of $100,000 amount also. And so it came out to be $118,000. And John, he left Boulder after JonBenet's death, and I don't believe that his DNA was ever tested to that unknown male DNA. Michael Helgoth, his DNA was tested, and the other gentleman in his realm. Well, this ends this episode of Unsolved, and the next episode will be about the Zodiac Killer, and that will be tomorrow evening. So I'll see you.